Hi, this is Dr. Diane Gayhart, and this is my lecture on existential psychotherapy and counseling. It's designed to accompany my text case documentation in counseling and psychotherapy and theory and treatment planning and psychotherapy, both published by Cengage. And you can also find lots of other resources, including links to the various online lectures that accompany the various textbooks at my website, masteringcompetencies.com. So we refer to existential therapy, and often you'll hear it referred to as there's one thing that's existential therapy. There are actually several different strands of existential therapy that have evolved and exist over the year, and they're all similar in that they share this that they're grounded in existential philosophy, which really addresses, as you may remember from some of your college courses, questions related to existence in terms of what's the meaning of life, why are we here, why do we suffer, what is death? These bigger questions that many of us tortured our parents with at various points in our youth, and teenagers are famous for kind of loving to ponder these, often coming up with answers quite different than their parents. So this is what the whole therapy model is grounded on. And the basic, if you want to do a really big picture, kind of really get it in a nutshell, all of these schools of existential are saying whatever our kind of surface level suffering is, we're fighting with our partners, or struggling with our relationship with our children, or we feel depressed or anxious or a panic attack. The basic assumption in existential therapy is that those kind of more surface level symptoms of anxiety, depression, relational issues are really grounded fundamentally in some of these existential issues and how a person is handling them or avoiding them. And so that's what all of these are basically looking at. But there are various strands, and existential therapy can look quite different across these schools. So, for example, this Dasein analysis it's going to have a much more of a feel of a more psychodynamic type of approach, and so it's going to have more of that flavor to it, and it also is focusing on how is the person engaging their environment, and how is that creating the suffering that they're experiencing. Logotherapy, associated with Viktor Frankl, who many of us are associated with, who is just an amazing man who who was actually in Nazi concentration camps and developed his ideas around logotherapy based on his experiencing of suffering and watching how people suffered in those concentration camps. Very powerful writer and speaker. And his idea is, and his version of existential is a bit different than any of the others in that, because most existential philosophers will say life is inherently meaningless and we have to find the meaning, create the meaning in life. Where Viktor Frankl is unique among most of these existentialists in that he does believe that life is inherently meaningful. And so, believe it or not, it's a pretty radical position in the world of existentialism. So that his book, many hope you should read it if you haven't, Man's Search for Meaning, very powerful book, classic, read both in the field and out of the field. So, and this is Man's Search for Meaning. And so his whole approach to therapy, his focus is on that. There's also what's called the American Existential Humanistic Approach. And as the title reveals, it blends in some humanistic assumptions, primarily this idea of trying to find or create or to be true to your true self. So it's much more inward focus in terms of being true to yourself, where like the Dasein analysis is much more focusing on how you relate to the world. And then finally, you'll also hear about the British School of Existential Analysis. And it actually represents a fairly diverse group of practitioners in this area. But there is kind of coalesces around some basic themes of focusing on the dimensions of physical, social, personal, and spiritual. So it's got multiple layers to how they conceptualize kind of our existential dilemmas. So all of that said, so if you really get into existential therapy, these various strands are going to be more important to you. But for many of us, we think of existential as kind of, the themes across these are very, very similar, and how they work is similar, although you can have variations on this, obviously. And quite frequently, actually, in the 21st century, there are a lot of people who will combine more humanistic approaches, like person-centered, with existential, as there is a fair amount of philosophical overlap between the two. Especially when you look at something like logotherapy that believes that life is inherently meaningful. So that's the basic lay of the land, and now we're going to move on to some more talking about existential therapy in a global way. Existential therapy in a nutshell, the least you need to know, and so I just want to go through and give you an overview of the main features of this approach. So as the name implies, as I've always mentioned when we talked about the various schools, that the basic focus of existential therapy is to address these more profound underlying existential issues that are part of being human. So finding meaning in life, dealing with identity and crises in identity and how we shape that, confronting our ultimate aloneness in the universe, confronting the reality of death for ourselves and those we love, managing the larger existential anxieties that are just part of being human. And so this, again, the basic fundamental assumption is it's these existential issues that are the real source of whatever symptoms a client might be presenting. There's also a basic philosophical stance that all schools of existentialism assume, and that is that humans are basically free to make choices as well as responsible for their choices and their actions. So this is one of the inherent one of the assumptions of existentialism is that there's this inherent tension between our freedom and our responsibility. And those two are inherently connected. And I remember when I was first introduced to the ideas of existentialism, there was always this, we all want this freedom, but with all this freedom does come responsibility, and those two go hand in hand. So the more freedom you have, the more responsibility you have for your choices, and for your own happiness too, as well as the effect of your choices on others. And so the basic premise of the existential counseling and psychotherapy process is that clients learn to consciously define themselves and their lives, to consciously make choices and take responsibility for them. And so whether you're looking at someone who's dealing with depression or relationship issues, you would, underneath that all is, what decisions are you making? You are free to make all of these decisions. Ultimately, you really are. And so what are you deciding to do? And what responsibilities go with that? And so that's the basic premise of existentialism in a nutshell. So now I want to take a moment to talk about what I like to call the juice, the significant contributions of existentialism to the whole field of counseling and psychotherapy at a broader level. Now, arguably, there are many things that I could have chosen within the scope of existential therapy as the juice, and for me, at least, I identified the concept of the I-thou relationship that Martin Buber so eloquently describes in his work. And Martin Buber's concept of the I-thou encounter is used by existential therapists and often sometimes even by humanistic therapists in just conceptualizing how to relate to clients. And the basic premise here is that humans can relate in one of two ways. The I-it relationship is when I relate to you or a person as an object. And in fact, as I'm sitting here lecturing, it's an I-it relationship. You're not in front of me, you can't respond. So I'm, speaking as a speaker and you're listening as a listener. And the fact is that 98% of our interactions are going to be I-it encounters. When you do transactions at the grocery store, when you come home and talk to your partner about plans for the weekend. And so all of those are more I-it interactions. And we have to have I-it interactions. But he distinguishes those from the I-thou experience. And the I-thou, so in an I-it, it's like it's a person and an object in their world. And so you're often relating to your conceptualization of the person more than, the genuine, authentic, true self, if you want to call it that, of the person. And so even with our partners, a lot of our interactions are I-it interactions. They are your partner, and so you're interacting with them with your partner. Where the I-thou is a much more sacred encounter. That is more how Buber would, the term he would use to describe it, and that you encounter the other person as a fully independent subject and you recognize that they are creating their own realities and their own meanings. And it's a very profound encounter, and you may recall some of these moments in your life. Often you're in dialogue, but not always, where you felt like the other person really was there, putting aside all of their conceptualizations of who you should be or ought to be, but were fully experiencing you as you are, your true self. You were able to share that and have that encounter, and you were experiencing them in the same way too. And so this is a very profound experience, and it is what existential therapists would say they're striving to do when they relate to their clients. And so this concept of the I-thou relationship, I think, is a very profound one, because oftentimes counselors and psychotherapists, psychologists, social workers, we can get into playing our role. We're the professional, and we kind of hide behind that mask. And the existentialists, much like the humanists, would say, you need to take down that and have this true, authentic, very raw, and sacred encounter with our clients, and experience them as a true, independent subject, and vice versa. So this is the I-thou encounter that I think is a very important concept in this theory, and really can inform any type of therapy that you choose to work from. So now I'm going to move on to tell you a little bit about, just to give you an overview of just the various process of what existential psychotherapy looks like, the big picture. So existential therapy can be conceptualized in 3 different phases. In the first phase, the therapist and client work together to identify how the presenting problem is related to the existential assumptions and beliefs. So again, here what you're doing is you're starting at the surface and working down to where their depression or anxiety or relationship conflicts are relating to, their fear of isolation, or relating to the fear of death or impermanence, or fear of being alone. So that's what so in the first phase, you would be working on linking the symptoms to the existential assumptions and beliefs. Then in the second phase, you're moving into, you invite the clients to examine and redefine some of these attitudes regarding death and freedom, responsibility, choice, meaning, meaninglessness, all of these things. So you go in and you start exploring these beliefs and attitudes, and looking at where they may need to shift in order to live a more meaningful life, and one that no longer has these symptoms. And then finally in phase 3, you are taking, you take these shift in beliefs and translate it to the real world. And so taking specific action to lead a more fulfilling and meaningful self-actualized life. And so if there was a lot of existential anxieties holding a person back from loving fully, or, following, their life passion, whatever it might be, the action piece would come in phase 3. And so I think it's fair to say that another common thing that you're going to be seeing as you go across these stages is that you will be dealing with what they call existential anxieties. And so these typically fall into four basic areas: the death and anxiety related to that, freedom and responsibility, isolation and relationship, and meaninglessness and meaning, life meaning. And so these are common themes. They're just part of being human, the existentialists will say. And these themes kind of run through everyone's life. And so they're looking, in phase one for how these are related to the clients presenting problems. Phase two, you go through and you kind of maybe redefine, discuss, reflect on, and more consciously choose, how you're going to express your freedom and how you are going to, take on the responsibility that it comes with freedom. And, looking at isolation versus being in a relationship, and also how a person finds meaning, creates meaning in his or her life. So now I want to go on and we're going to talk about the therapeutic relationship. We already did that a bit in the juice section, but we're going to go a little bit deeper here. So the therapeutic relationship in existential therapy, as I already mentioned, is grounded on this concept of the I-thou encounter and relationship between a client and the therapist, which is quite intense in some ways. It's a very here and now, in the moment way of being with clients. And in addition to that, what is distinct, and probably you would notice this if you were watching someone who works from more humanistic approach, which is often combined with existential therapy, where there's a lot of empathy being expressed in humanism. There's the existentialist is present. They are empathetic, but that's not their main leading edge. And a lot of what you will see that's a bit different in this approach is that the therapist does promote responsibility and independence. And so there's a little more, less of the warmth and more of stepping back and having the client take responsibility for whether or not, rather than validating a feeling, having the client taking responsibility for judging whether it's an appropriate emotion or not for the context, rather than the therapist doing it. So there is this difference that you would see between existentialism and humanistic approach in terms of the therapist being much more focused on promoting the client's ability to validate themselves rather than rely on the therapist to do it. And much more pointing out the areas of freedom versus responsibility. And so there is a bit of a difference between the purely existential versus humanistic way of relating to clients that can be noticeable, even though the two approaches are frequently combined. So now let's talk about the viewing or case conceptualization in existential psychotherapy. So typically when existential psychotherapists conceptualize with the client situation, they're going to look for several of these kind of areas, themes, including that we've mentioned before: meaning and meaninglessness, finding purpose, freedom and responsibility, existential anxiety and guilt. And I guess I should mention that existential anxiety isn't like anxiety necessarily related that would be diagnosed in the DSM. Existential anxiety is what we all have as part of the human condition. Death anxiety, existential angst, and the purpose of neuroses are. So we're going to talk through each one of these separately. So most existentialists take the position that life is inherently meaningless, and that there is this will to meaning, that we need to have meaning, and that is just part. Humans seek out meanings. We tend to be happier, but we have this will, we have this need to have meaning in our lives. And so the existentialists work with their clients to have them consciously choose the sources of meaning and purpose in their life. For example, many of us are kind of handed down, what that meaning should be from our parents, from our culture. And so, for example, the white picket fence story that is predominant in the U.S., having a house with a fence and the 2.5 kids, and the nice car in the driveway and the granite counters or whatever it might be. This is our story of, now we are living the good life. This is what it's supposed to look like. And so existential therapists would actually have clients look at that if that appears to be the where they're finding meaning in their lives. The existential therapist would have clients actually question that, and does that fit for you? Is it bringing you meaning? Is it bringing you happiness? Do you agree with this? Are there parts you want to shift or change or let go of? And are there other places that you want to look for meaning in your life? And so, clients, therapists have these often very difficult conversations with clients about where they are finding the meaning and purpose in their life. And in this newer recovery model approach to mental health, which is actually adopted formally by the U.S., Europe, Australia, Japan. Many countries that have formalized mental health care services have adopted a recovery orientation for treating severe and chronic mental illness. And one of the main focuses is finding meaning and purpose in your life, even if you have a history of having psychosis or mania, bipolar type issues. Where's the meaning? Where's the purpose? And that they find that this is very important to actually working with clients with the chronic mental illness. So freedom and responsibility are another major focus for existential therapists. And existential therapists look at their clients' lives and the stories clients tell themselves about their freedom and responsibilities, and their responsibility and how they assume that responsibility that goes with it. Because most of us go through life and we kind of don't feel free. We feel like we have to get up in the morning and go to work. We feel like we have to spend time with our partner. We have to, keep our, dress nice, look nice. We have to take care of our children. There is a certain... But still, the existentialists would say, do you have to take care of your children, or are you choosing to do that because you believe that's the right thing to do and that's what you want out of your life? And so a lot of us begin to feel like we have to do all these things and we don't have a choice, where ultimately we always have a choice. There are consequences, obviously, with all of our choices. If you choose not to take care of your children, they will most likely, in many countries, be taken over by the state, so the state can take care of them. So you have to take responsibility. If you're not going to be taking care of your children, or you're not going to get up and go to work, you probably won't have enough money to live unless you have money somewhere else. And so there are consequences. You are always free to choose, even though we feel like we can't, because we just don't want the consequences. And what the existential therapist would say, but you're choosing not to have those consequences, but you are choosing. You are free to choose. And, you may decide you don't want to maintain that standard of living, to, have to keep a job that you don't really enjoy doing at all. Maybe it's not all worth it. And so these are the type of conversations therapists will have with clients around freedom and responsibility. So yes, and so they see these two as inherently connected, that freedom always implies responsibility. And even a failure to act is a choice. It is you freely chose that, and then you must be responsible for that. And so, oftentimes existential therapists working with adults will have them look at major choice points in a person's life in terms of choosing to do homework in high school or not, choosing to, go on to college or not, choosing to study what you studied in college or not, choosing who you married, choosing where to live, choosing whether or not you took adventurous vacations or were adventurous or didn't take risk, So they have their clients go, often will go back through and analyze and look at how they had freedoms, how they chose it, and what, how they need to take responsibility for those consequences. And so as clients are talking, an existential therapist is always kind of listening for where is it that the client doesn't feel free. Because ultimately we are all free every moment of our lives to make decisions. And this comes from some of Viktor Frankl's very profound and poignant work on, even in a Nazi concentration camp, where arguably you don't have a lot of freedom about where you are, but in your mind you are free. And that's what some of his insights came from, that is that in your mind, how you think about it, how you engage, the choices you make, you're still free. You're always free. Even imprisoned, you can still experience a sense of freedom. And that's very profound. Again, existential therapy is not for the faint of heart, because you engage in some pretty difficult issues. And so this is how they work with freedom and responsibility. And as you can see, this isn't always warm and fuzzy, because most of us don't want to hear, you are free to not go to work. That's your choice. I mean, most of us, our initial response to that is not positive. And we normally don't like to hear that. We're not usually happy with the person who points that out for us. But that is some of how an existential therapist would work. So another area that existential therapists and counselors would use to conceptualize their work with clients and what's going on with clients is they would, as they listen to clients talk, they will listen for how aware is the client and conscious is the client of their life. This ability to be self-aware. Are you aware of your thoughts, your feelings, your choices, your desires, your actions? Sometimes you can sit with somebody and they have very little sense of where meaning comes from in their life or where it could come from. They very often may not even have a sense of who they are. Often if they've been in an abusive relationship, emotionally abusive relationship, it's people feel very even unaware of their own thoughts and feelings because of the abusive situation. And so this is another area that existential therapists use to conceptualize what's going on with clients. So another signature really concept in existentialism is death anxiety. And this is, they posit a part of being human is this fear of dying. It seems to be instinctual, they would say. And that, and they argue that this fear of death plays a major role in a lot of psychopathology in terms of, depression, anxiety, those sorts of issues. And they see that humans, and this is where you can see some psychodynamic influence here, they see that humans are basically in denial about death, and we live our lives often in denial, many of us do, about death, and that they believe, particularly when you're in denial, that you may die, others may die, that this can create a lot of it's kind of secondary symptoms, and that use a lot of defenses, such as denial, to maintain this facade, to maintain this kind of untrue belief and go about our daily business like that's not necessarily the case. And I think this begins to make some sense when you lose someone close to you. Often, many of us, that kind of denial is shattered, and it normally puts most of us into a very different state of mind and a way of being. And oftentimes, people reprioritize their life after an experience where the illusion that we're living, we're never going to die, gets shattered. That's often a very profound moment in a person's life. And so they look at assessing how and in what ways this fear of death may be related to the presenting problem, in terms of, an example might be panic attack. Often can be related to this death fear, I think, in a way that makes a lot of sense. And in the terms of, often panic comes from someone gets into this state of they feel like they might die, that they're going to die. And that anxiety can often be related to something else in their life, the more profound kind of fear of death underneath that. So also they work on having their clients accept that they will die, that others will die, and they do this not to be depressing, um, because it's reality. And so, how do you engage that reality without becoming anxious or depressed, so that the clients can hope, and they believe that when you can accept this reality, that you'll make better choices, that you will take more responsibility in your life for how your actions and words affect others, how your choices affect your life, and so that you will make choices and take action that helps you get the most out of life and live with a real respect for life and its sacredness and its fragility, really. And so existential therapists will often work on this, and often when I'm working with a client whose life has been touched by death, either a near-death experience or losing someone, these issues of death and life and its meaning come up. Even if I'm not planning to do existential therapy, it comes up around these issues. Another term you'll hear about is existential angst or existential anxiety. And again, this is different from garden variety anxiety that may be diagnosed in the DSM. You may or may not have a DSM anxiety diagnosis, but the existentialists posit that we all have this existential angst, this anxiety that comes from the freedom and also the burden of responsibility that comes with that freedom. That we have to make choices, and those choices have real effect on ourselves and others. And so there's an inherent anxiety that's just part of that's not part of the DSM, and that you need to engage those anxieties effectively in order to avoid having more DSM, types of anxiety or depression or eating disorders or whatever it might be. And so these anxieties, these are part of being human. We're not going to psychoanalyze those away. Instead, we have to engage this type of anxiety and angst skillfully and with responsibility. And so it's very much a part of living consciously that you have to be aware of your freedom and your responsibility, the impact of your choices, and that you need to be consciously creating the meaning in your life. And so this is part of what existentialists help clients to effectively engage these existential anxieties so that they don't have other types of diagnosable disorders. And so finally, in conceptualizing, the counselor or therapist will look at the purpose of the neuroses. So, and again, this has a bit of a, neuroses has more of a psychoanalytic term here, so the purpose of the symptom might be a more contemporary way or non-psychodynamic way to say this. And so what is the purpose? And so existential therapists maintain that our symptoms that we're coming to therapy for are there as to preserve our sense of self against a perceived threat in the outside world. And so the therapist would look at the presenting problems that a person is having and link that and use that to help understand where action needs to be taken, where they need to be assuming responsibility, in their lives. So for example, if a person comes in saying that they're depressed, perhaps because of they're unhappy in their job or with their boss or whatever, that would give you a clue as to where the person is not taking responsibility for his or her choices, where they are not owning their true freedom in the situation. And so you would look at the depression and its relation to those issues and link that back down to these more underlying existential issues that the person needs to address. So now let's talk about setting goals and goal setting in existential therapy. So existential therapy and counseling has embedded within it a set of goals, long-term outcomes that they want for their clients, which is primarily to live an authentic and meaningful life. That's the long-term goal. So, finding meaning, being able to manage existential anxieties, and to focus on the existential issues rather than the symptoms. So there are these long-term goals that are kind of embedded in the approach. So in the early to middle phases of treatment, you're going to be taking smaller steps, towards recognizing the underlying existential issues, learning to manage those existential anxieties effectively, exploring a person's relationships and beliefs around death, and how that informs how they should live. So they they have that long-term goal, and then what you would do is break down small steps to help the client, move past their symptoms to be able to effectively engage these existential issues. So now let's talk about the doing interventions in existential therapy. And it is a very typically is a very process-oriented approach. And so these interventions are more on the subtle side in terms of promoting this process of identifying the underlying existential issues and reflecting on them to create real-life change. So many of the interventions in existential therapy focus on having direct conversation, inviting clients to talk directly about issues that these existential issues. So, inviting clients to identify where do they find meaning in their life? Do they approve of this? Is this what they want to keep doing? And how do they do that more effectively? And how do you find that meaning in life? Often very much part of the conversation, especially when working with depression. Also acknowledging existential isolation. This is a difficult one because the existentialist would say that fundamentally all of us are alone. We come into this world alone and we're going to die alone, most likely. And so, and that we journey through this life alone, and that a person needs to accept that, own that, and make good choices around life because of that. And so when we're in denial of this and we live with the assumption that our partner or our child will be with us forever, and that's the way life is supposed to be, should be, I'm entitled to that. When you live with that attitude, which many of us do, and a lot of cultures kind of have those assumptions embedded in them, that can cause a lot of suffering down the road when life doesn't go according to plan. So they also look at defining and affirming the self to really achieve a true sense of freedom. So many of us are quick to say that, we don't feel our sense of freedom, and that we are who we are because we maybe have to be because of our families, or this happened to us, or my partner would never let me be this way. And so the existential therapist would challenge all of those, kind of excuses almost for why we're not who we want to be in life, and have the client learn to define themselves and be the one who validates and affirms that self rather than looking to others. It's really nice when other people affirm who we are. It feels really good, but it does not lead to sustainable happiness and depression and anxiety-free, symptom-free living. So what they do is work on having the client learn challenging the client really to define who they are and then validate that themselves rather than looking to someone else to do that, whether it's the therapist or someone in the person's life. They do talk about courage, and they use encouragement too, in that the existential therapist will talk about the courage it takes to really engage these issues. These are not comfortable issues to talk about. And it also takes courage to own one's freedom and to take full responsibility for it. And so they try to bolster that courage and I'll use encouragement often to do so. They also have clients examine and look at the themes of love and belongingness, because even though there's this paradox. Yes, we are isolated. We come into this world alone. We leave alone. But we have a need for love and to love, and we have a need to belong. And oftentimes, many of us will sacrifice significant things to make that happen. And so existential therapists invite their clients to explore how clients are finding love and belongingness. Where are they making sacrifices that are too much? By that might be not being their true self, because my partner wouldn't love me if I was a certain way, or express this true part of myself, sort of thing. Or I wouldn't have my friends wouldn't like me, if they knew that I actually prefer to sit home and watch movies, on a Saturday night rather than go out and party or whatever it might be. And so where are we contorting ourselves to be who we all just think? Often we contort ourselves to be who we think the other person or someone else wants us to be, to get their acceptance. And often we're wrong. And finally, we have paradoxical intention, and this is some of the earliest kind of paradoxical approaches. And so if a client is struggling with what would be a neurotic anxiety, so what I would call the DSM type of anxieties, they would often actually prescribe what we would call a paradoxical intervention that was very much developed in family therapy, and also to a certain extent in CBT, where they would have the client, if they've got a fear, agoraphobia, you would have them actually go to the place and give them an assignment like to double the intensity of the panic attack. And so you got to have a playful way. So what you're doing is recontextualizing the symptom. So you're asking them to consciously engage in it in a slightly different way. And by doing that, often it helps people, especially with symptoms they feel are uncontrollable, they begin to see where they do have control, where they do have choice, and where they do have some freedom. And so this paradoxical intention that really was very much developed in family therapy, you see some of the first use of it here with the existentialists. So now let's talk a little bit about the research and evidence base. So in terms of research studies that look at the effectiveness of existential therapy, there aren't a whole lot. Most of the research in this area or on this approach are what we would call case studies, and much in kind of like a psychoanalytic approach, where a therapist would it would report on how a person worked through these existential anxieties. As you can imagine, these philosophical concepts can be hard to operationalize, and often an existentialist isn't really interested in operationalizing and measuring it. So it's not really philosophically congruent to do a lot of, traditional scientific research. And so there has not been that much done. That said, that many of the qualities that are emphasized in how they build a therapeutic relationship, that being present, being real, being genuine, are identified in the common factors research. These are the factors that go across theories that work as to, the four major factors that go across various theories, and it explains why therapies work and why most therapies do work. And the quality of the therapeutic relationship that is supported by existential therapy does have an evidence base in the common factors research. And so finally, we're going to wrap up by talking a little bit about using the existential approach with diverse clients. So when you think of working with culturally and ethnically diverse clients, existentialism is a really interesting theory to think of in this context, because in large measure, a lot of what culture does is actually give us ways and rituals and strategies for managing the human condition. I mean, that's one way to look at culture. You think about death. What does it mean? How do we handle it? For most of us, that is very much defined, by cultural and religious traditions, and they're actually what get us through this very difficult part of being human. And so it's very important when working from an existential perspective to be aware of a person's culture and gender and social class, because so much of that informs how, all of our assumptions around these very difficult and existential issues, and inform how we have decided to construct meaning. Where does meaning come from? Often, again, here too, social class, gender, ethnicity, our cultural stories and values, they inform what we find to be meaningful. So that's, even just individualistic versus collectivist cultures. They very much are defining where meaning comes from. And so if you're working with someone from an individualistic culture, like the United States or Northern Europe, a lot of their meaning is going to be coming from their identity. Where when working with the collectivist people from collectivist cultures, there is more meaning found in relationship and community. And so it's also many of the ideas in existentialism are, and many of the values that it's saying, this whole idea of you have freedom, you have choice, those are very individualistic values. And so you also need to be aware of how that may not translate so well across cultures, especially to those that have more collectivist cultures. And so that's an important to be aware of. So focusing more on just how meaning is constructed rather than insisting that clients assume certain perspectives that might be more individualistic. And so it's just important to be very cautious because it's pretty easy, it can be easy to take these existential ideas and to say, but you really are free to, you don't have to do what your parents say, and you don't have to do what your culture says. I think we need to try to tread much more gently when working with people who would be from a collectivist culture and say, no, they don't see it that way. Additionally, existentialism has been been used to work with clients who gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered clients, and this can be very useful in helping them begin to explore how they are constructing their sexual identity, and look at both their experience of their sexuality and the interpersonal reality of it, and also looking at the freedom and choices and responsibilities and the consequences, the constraints, and to explore all these things by looking at the underlying existential issues of the person, and how often being a minority can really augment that sense of isolation. And how do you engage that where, to a certain extent, all of us are alone, and often the experience of being different makes that experience much more painful. So I hope you found this introduction to existentialism helpful and useful to you, and I encourage you to read more. In my textbooks you'll find ways to conceptualize, templates for conceptualizing and developing treatment plans using existential therapy. And I also encourage you to read further the original works in the field by Viktor Frankl, as I mentioned, and Rollo May, and many others. It's a very fascinating area of psychotherapy to explore.